Welcome. Well, it's Lifelong Learning Week, and this week is all about raising the profile of lifelong learning and celebrating the best of adult learning. Now, there's lots going on all week, including our Festival of Learning Awards ceremony tomorrow. So check out the Learning and Work website and our Twitter feed for more detail. Now, this webinar is here to help us launch the week, and we'll be looking at new learning and work research on adult participation in learning, and in particular on adult learning during lockdown. And then we'll be using this data to stimulate the discussion about what this means, why it matters, and why and how we can do more to engage adults in learning. I'm delighted that City and Guilds have kindly agreed to sponsor this event, and that we also have their Executive Director of Strategic Partnerships who will be responding later on in the event. First of all, I'll be presenting the findings from the participation survey, and we'll also be hearing from Baroness Sue Garden, who is Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on FE and Lifelong Learning, and from Susan Pember from HOLEX. Now, there's a time for questions and answers at the end, so please put your questions and comments on Slido. If you're using Twitter, please share your thoughts there too using the hashtag Lifelong Learning Week. So let's turn to the findings of the survey. Now, on this slide, what you'll see before we go into the findings of this year's survey is a reminder that Learning and Work Institute has been mapping participation of adult learning for more than 20 years. And on the next slide, what you'll see is the results of the survey across those 2 decades. Now, you'll see that across this time period, participation in learning has been relatively stable. Around 2/5 of adults say that they've engaged in some form of learning and training over the previous 3 years. But more recently, we've seen a decade of decline, and that's been both in significant cuts to public funding, but also a dramatic fall in adult engagement in learning. And in recent years, as you'll see to the right hand of your screen, we've seen a year-on-year decline in participation. If you can go back a slide, in 2019, we saw the lowest level of participation ever recorded, just 1 in 3 adults, 33%, having taken part in learning in the last 3 years. Now, on the next slide, you'll see the definition of learning that we use in our survey. Our surveys of 5,000 adults across the UK, and we give them this definition and we ask them about their experience of learning. Are they currently learning? Have they engaged in learning over the last 3 years? Maybe more of a long time ago, or perhaps not since leaving full-time education. And we've deliberately adopted a broad definition of learning. It includes both informal and formal and non-formal. It's beyond publicly funded provision and includes, yes, classes and courses, but also learning and training at work and independent learning on your own and with others. This is a really expansive view of what learning is. So on the next slide, in our 2020 survey, this is what adults told us. 60% of adults in this year's survey said that they had engaged in learning in the last 3 years. And you'll remember from the previous slides that actually this is much higher than we've seen across the survey series. And it reflects what we're hearing from learning providers, from recruitment agencies, and from digital platforms. Now, we've been careful about comparing this with previous years because we had to change the approach to the survey in response to COVID, so the figures aren't directly comparable. But we are encouraged that during the last 3 years, and particularly now, we are seeing more adults engaged in learning, and that is surely good news. Now, knowing that there would be some challenges in comparing the data and recognising the particular interest this year in thinking about which adults have engaged in learning as a result of the crisis, we wanted to give particular focus on adults that engaged in learning during the lockdown. And what we found, as you'll see on the next slide, is that many adults embraced the opportunity to learn during lockdown. Now, cast your mind back to March 2020, when the UK government implemented the first national lockdown. Many millions of people worked from home or were furloughed, parents homeschooled their children, Adult learning providers suspended in-person teaching, and where possible, lots of learning was delivered online instead. And we found that 2 in 5 adults, 43% indeed, used some of this time to learn new things and to develop their skills. And we estimate that that's around 22 million adults in the UK. Surely that's great news. And when we asked them how they did their learning, what we found is that lockdown accelerated a growth in online learning. Now, we know there's been a steady growth over recent years anyway, but COVID has certainly accelerated this. We found that 60% of learners did all their learning online. Another 30% did some of their learning online, and just 10% of learners learned completely offline. Now, of course, some learners had already been doing some online learning, but 44% said that they did more of this as a result of lockdown. And with institutions and workplaces closed or operating remotely, lots of people took to learning independently. That was 55%, more than half of adults learning on their own. A quarter were learning through apps, websites and social media. So kind of great news for the advance in online learning, although of course it poses real challenges around a growing digital divide. When we looked at why adults were learning, we found that many adults, as 1 in 3, as you can see on the next slide, were learning for work-related reasons. But of course, the reasons for doing so are often really broad. Others were learning for personal development or for personal interest or a hobby. Lots of a really broad range of reasons. And when we asked about how adults have been able to get to engage in learning during this time, around 1 in 10 said actually the reduced work and time pressures of lockdown had enabled them to learn. A similar proportion said that they took up learning in order to help them fill their time. Of course, learning during lockdown, challenges for individuals were all very different. And while some people had extra time, many others found their time pressures squeezed. And of course, as you can see from the next slide, there's some real challenges of lockdown learning too. 1 in 5 learners found that learning that they had previously planned was postponed or cancelled, and others really struggled to balance lockdown learning with work pressures or with childcare or homeschooling or consistent access to technology, which brings us back to that point around the digital divide. As you might expect, 1 in 10 learners really struggled to maintain motivation during this period. And 1 in 8 found that a lack of face-to-face contact with other learners was really difficult and something they struggled with as they tried to continue learning during this period. Now, it's great news that so many adults engaged with learning at this time. But as we see across the whole of our adult participation in learning series, there are some really stark inequalities in who engage with learning during lockdown. And that very much echoes what we see across the wider survey series. So on the next slide, you'll see that this is our participation in learning during lockdown by social grade. And you can see that those in the highest social grade, AB, are nearly twice as likely to have learned than those in D in the lowest social grade. What we know is that younger adults, full-time workers, those in higher grades as we see here, and those with more years of initial education were all more likely to be learning. And as I say, it's not unexpected given what we see in our wider survey, but it is concerning given what we know about the unequal impact of the pandemic in the labour market. Previous research that Learning and Work Institute has done shows that workers with fewer qualifications, those in lower skilled and lower paid jobs, are more likely to have been furloughed or lost their jobs. And so these are the parts of the population that are most likely to need to upskill or to retrain for the post-COVID economy. And yet these findings show that they were least likely to access opportunities. In fact, when we look at full-time employees and look at the difference between those who are furloughed and those who continue to work, Actually, it was those who continued to work who were most likely to learn, and those who were furloughed, perhaps with more time, but certainly whose jobs were at greater risk, actually were less likely to participate. That's a real challenge, and something we might come on to in the discussion later when thinking about how we don't reinforce some of the inequalities in the workplace and in learning, but how we might address them. So as we think about the next steps, one of the things we do know is that learning begets learning. So 91% of lockdown learners who were doing some online learning say that they are likely to continue to engage in online learning in the future. 64%, so 2/3 of them, say that they are very likely to continue, and that is great news. We also know from the next slide, and this is a slide that we see every year in the survey, is that where we can engage adults in learning, where we can develop an appetite for it, where we can give people confidence in their own ability to learn and experience of the benefits of learning, then those adults are more likely to carry on engaging in learning. And in fact, it's those with no experience or experience quite a significant time away that are least likely to learn. The best way to create lifelong learners is to get people started in the first place, and therefore surely this experience of lockdown learning is an opportunity not to be missed. Now, I'd like to bring an end to my presentation there, although happy to answer any questions on the survey. What I'd like to do is to introduce our contributors to respond to these findings and to think about what they think is needed to engage more adults in lifelong learning. As I say, if you've got comments and questions, then please put them up on Slido or on Twitter using the hashtag Lifelong Learning Week. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Baroness Sue Garden to respond to the findings. Sue.
Well, thank you very much, Fiona. It's a fascinating research project, and thank you for your presentation. I declare an interest as a fellow of Birkbeck with its historic remit for evening classes for those in work pursuing degree studies. Birkbeck and the Open University, which has just celebrated its 50th anniversary, have seen dramatic declines in adult learners since the government policies changed, which changed funding. And on your slides, I like the 3% who learnt because I had to. I wonder what was behind that. Anyway, I'm delighted to see Patrick here today. I worked for 20 years for City and Guilds, and I'm now Vice President. And I won't steal his thunder, but City and Guilds primarily accredits adult learners seeking to enhance their qualifications or to change direction from engineering to floristry or hairdressing to construction or vice versa. We witness some wonderful transitions as people realize later in life that they have hidden talents and enthusiasms which they wish to pursue. I've come late to politics as a Liberal Democrat. I was a teacher from time to time during 24 moves with my RAF husband before I joined City and Guilds, so my career is a complete mess, obviously. And I'm a staunch believer that compulsory education should primarily encourage a love of learning and, as Fiona has set out, a confidence in learning. I bemoan the fact that the current system is so geared to academic exam success that it marginalizes young people with practical, technical, and creative skills and talents, and leads them to believe that learning is about passing exams rather than the excitement of new experiences. Lockdown, of course, has forced many of us into new learning. In the Lords, we've had to learn Zoom and Teams. I sit on the woolsack, improvising when the technology fails or people are inexplicably muted when trying hard to communicate. But I'm part of a generation for whom technology was unknown when we were growing up. We lived for much of our early marriage without a telephone, for instance, and somehow we coped. My late husband was extremely computerate even before computers were invented, which rendered me rather lazy for my sins. But my grandchildren try to ensure that my mobile phone is up to date and to get me out of scrapes when I'm shouting at the screen. And of course, new learning matters for our everyday life. The barriers are often lack of confidence, worry about the unknown, about getting things wrong. But of course, we never improve if we don't ever get things wrong. And government cuts in funding have been barriers, as have the loss of the free further education programs, which used to be such wonderful opportunities to try new things. I taught in FE college for a while, Having enthusiastic adult learners who had chosen to learn French and Spanish made a heartening change from some of my less than enthusiastic compulsory language school students. There were wonderful creative courses. There was art, flower arranging, pottery, fashion, which often led to rewarding hobbies, but often too to rewarding employment. And for those who did not consider themselves natural learners, working at something which gave them a level 1 certificate could be the icing on the cake. For those who had never gained a national certificate in anything, a much derided MVQ level 1 could open the door to confidence and excitement over learning. And I was sorry when Alison Wolf's reviews scorned level 1 as being no use to anyone. It was of enormous use as a stepping stone for nervous learners. What can we do to support more adults to take part in lifelong learning and to narrow the inequalities in learning as set out in the report? What we can do is encourage every tiny step that reluctant learners take. We should build on the post-18 review of education to even up funding between HE and FE. The review, which the government seems to have kicked into the long grass, so no surprises there, but it gave a big opportunity to tackle post-18 student finance, to broaden learning options and make progression routes more obvious. When I was a coalition government whip and minister, heady days that they were too, I was always concerned that ministers and officials had almost all come through the university route and could be blissfully unaware of the huge talents of those who had followed vocational routes, apprenticeships, technical education. And this was, and I served in the Department for Education and indeed BIS on skills and apprenticeships. And it was the same really throughout the ministers and the officials, that they were predominantly university graduates. So we have a task to do to educate the decision makers. We need more resources in parts of the country and among communities where education is not seen as the way forward. We must prize young people who can make and do rather than think and write. Schools must be given incentives to recognize that troublemakers could be energetic problem solvers rather than problem makers. If we look at the delight in achievement on the face of a Chinese child who takes its first step or says its first word, we should encourage that same delight in a first sum, a first foreign language, a first successful scientific experiment. And with the massive knock to the economy of COVID, we need everyone to explore new interests and new talents. We need them to have the confidence to look for new doors to open as old doors slam shut behind them. We must find hope for tomorrow, even if we have to prepare for the lockdown today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sue. That was great, and lots there to think about. And I see some questions already coming up, which we'll come to later. Sue Pember, can I come to you next, please, for your thoughts about what the survey findings show and what you think needs to be done next?
Thank you, Fiona, and thank you for Sue Gardner nearly taking everything I wanted to say, but that's all right, it just proves that good thoughts are shared. First of all, lifetime learning or lifelong learning has always mattered, but the problem we've got in this country is that many people who really need to learn new things are the ones most unlikely to take it up. And that's really the problem we have. So we still have 17 million people without level 2. We still have our 9 million people with poor basic skills. And what's really sad, that pipeline gets bigger every year. Every year we have more people leaving school without good language skills, without good literacy and numeracy. And those are the young people who often then go on to be the adults without qualification, the adults who've got low paid jobs, the adults who get low wages. And what COVID has shown us is that those are the adults who are first out. They're the first to be made unemployed. They're the first to be put on furlough. And they are probably going to be the ones that we will struggle to get back into work. And with this extension of the lockdown, we've got to really think this through, I think, in a completely different way. Now, in this country, we've always had a really good platform for lifelong learning. We've got more people in university than probably ever before. We've got more people who've done a master's. But at the other end, as I said, we've got more people with poor basic skills. And we need to sort of balance that out more. Now, I'm not one of these people that thinks that we should have less people in HE. I don't think that at all. What I think is that we need more people in the pipeline. We need more people doing level 2, more people doing level 3, so that they can go on to a level 4. So they've got an aspiration, they've got somewhere to aim for. But to do that, we need to change what we're offering. We can see, again, with online learning, those who have learned in the past have turned to online learning and doing it quite well. Although I'd be quite interested to see like completion stats. We've all started that video on learning something new, but do we actually finish it? And will that turn into real skills learned? Or will it actually just lead to more people thinking that they know a bit, but actually not enough or to be able to sustain in a job? So what do we need to do? Well, I think we should be using this time, and we need to work with DWP to say, right, if you are low skilled, and you are going to be supported by the state, then we are going to provide you with some meaningful training that turns into a qualification, which will turn into a better job. All the research shows now that, even a level 1 qualification, does have a monetary plus. And level 2 actually does demonstrate that you are more likely to stay in a sustainable job. So what do we need to do? Well, we need to, I think, a major intervention now. We need to say to people, right, this is the time to relearn. We need to work with DWP and change probably their philosophy that any job is a good job. No, that's not right. We need now to use this break in time and help people train. We also need to understand that if you are going to train, if you are going to take up a year of your life and do a new course that leads to a qualification, you do need some support. You do need a maintenance award. Now, it would be great if that was a grant, but again, if you're doing level 3 or a level 2 and you're doing it full time, then maybe you should be allowed to continue with your universal credit, or you should be given a maintenance loan to do that. But we also need it delivered in different ways. We need it to be modularized, but not just modularized where you pick and choose and never get qualified. We need to have modularization. Much of it can be done online, but with that, we need to have extra wraparounds. Like we need mentors. We need the role the teacher does in making sure somebody finishes something shouldn't be undervalued. We need more of that. So we need to perform a different structure, different wraparounds, different support around modularization. And we need to acknowledge that support. Maybe we need to create new roles, but we need to understand that teachers provide more than content. They're often the person's inspiration. They're the person that often changes those people's lives. And, targeting has become, not the right thing these days, but I really believe a good target mobilizes people behind it. So I really do think we should be setting targets for those who have not got a level 2, how many we now want to achieve a level 2 in the next 12 to 18 months. And we need to understand that people want to learn in their communities. Yes, they might want to learn online at the moment, but they really need to meet people. They really need to think about it. We need to think about integration. We need to think about social mobility. We need to think about people needing people. And I think one of the things that I've learned about lockdown, I've always loved stuff online, but actually I like seeing people more. And it's those conversations that make me creative. It's not, looking at content online. It's actually meeting other people. And also, we shouldn't understate, what peer group pressure is. That bit of that competitive edge you have in that classroom, that being pushed into something new, you can't quite get online. So though I'm an online advocate, especially at this moment, I don't think we've really thought about the curriculum and the support needed going forward. So thank you, Fiona, and thank you for doing that survey. It's been really interesting.
Thank you, Sue. And that's great. Loads of really good things to think about what we need in our I suppose, more formal education provision. Lots of the learning that will have taken place has been done online and independently. We don't know whether people have finished. We don't know about the quality of it. But I guess what it does show is there's lots of interest there if we can really capitalise that and engage people in a great offer. Thank you, Sue. We'll come back to some questions later. Patrick, can we come to you next? Thank you so much to City and Guilds for sponsoring this event. And I know you've had your own event this morning looking at some very similar issues. I wondered if we could ask you to contribute.
Yeah, certainly, and thank you very much, Fiona, for the opportunity to speak at this event and the start of an important week looking at lifelong learning, etc. So I'm at even more disadvantage now, having had to follow Baroness and Sue there, who've clearly covered all of the key topics. I think the bits that I'd like to home in on, I guess, are on the one hand, I think we have some potential positives there out of the level of engagement, participation, the adoption of online mode of delivery, etc. Partly, I guess, that might have been expected under the current climate, given the inevitable shift that had to occur. A number of commentators have I guess focused on the fact that we've seen a shift in a matter of weeks and months in a way of learning that people have been trying to introduce for decades before, and therefore these things are possible when demand arises. Now, having said all of that, I think the really key part for me that came across was the reality of just how hard it is still to reach that community of adult learners that we've been trying to reach for so long. And those that are engaged, you know, typically younger adults, typically those that have been in education for a bit longer, typically those, I guess, who fundamentally have had reinforced the value of learning from their previous experience, and those that seem furthest away are probably those that, for various reasons, have had reinforced that there isn't a value in learning because of their experience of mainstream and compulsory education. And I think that's the community that we need to reach out to. That's the community that we need to reinstill the benefits of learning. So the kind of things that we've been looking at is trying to ensure that people have a clear sight of, if they invest in some education, training, development, whatever it might be, there is a sort of a tangible direction and a tangible destination to that engagement. A lot of the work that we're doing around the skills bridges is very much focused on that principle. We start off with an end in mind. We start off with a suggestion that engagement in these areas of activity should lead to employment, should lead to progression, etc. Now, clearly the only way that you're going to instill that belief in people is for that evidence to appear and for them to learn themselves that they can see some value. I think the other thing I've always believed, both as a parent and working in and around education, is the power of positive reinforcement, the power of trying to instill in people a belief that actually you're not going to get things right every time, first time, but there is a discipline and a value in resilience and persistence. Equally, the recognition that negative reinforcement will simply lead to avoidance behaviour. It doesn't lead to greater resilience. If people have instilled in them a belief that they are not good at something and they have not excelled through traditional modes of learning, etc., they are unlikely to persevere. What they're more likely to do is to avoid doing it in the future. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to turn around and pay some attention to. We called it out before the pandemic. Our report, Missing Millions, had highlighted that if we were truly going to start to turn the dial on the economy and productivity in the UK, we couldn't just rely on the talent pipeline coming through schools and universities. We had to do something about the millions of people who are in an underemployed state in the workforce. Unfortunately, the pandemic has had a very negative impact on these people, and they need help now, as do a lot of people who are going to be unemployed between now and Christmas, to get back into work and give them the confidence to do so. I think the point was well made about ensuring that when we start to develop these programs, we are doing so in a way that reaches out to community. I think also there is generally a belief for adult learners that learning is not for them, not for people like them. And so therefore, the more that they can see people like them engaged in learning, the more I think it instills confidence. The models that we're looking at with our online delivery on Skills Bridges with Future Learn are based on a premise of social learning. So again, this idea that actually we can develop interaction, a different form, I admit, but a level of interaction and engagement with people in online communities through mentors and shared experience. And that's a very important aspect of any form of learning, whether that's virtual or face-to-face. So I think there's some things that we need to attend to. But I think there's some positives in terms of a change of direction, and there's some things that we need to grasp and reach out to the community that still appears to be disengaged from learning.
Thank you, Patrick. And some great points there, particularly about we're looking at sort of lockdown, quite a short time period, but actually we need to remember that there's a wider challenge that we faced before this. And I definitely recommend the City and Guilds report if you haven't already seen it. I'd like to ask our panel a few questions that we've been getting through the chat. So if you'd like to all put your videos on. Just first of all, I'd like to answer a few questions to the audience about the survey. So we have gone from doing a face-to-face survey to a telephone survey. We don't know whether that has increased the figures. All we know is that it's different, so it's not directly comparable. Maybe all of the increase is about more people learning, and I guess we'll know next year as we see further findings. It would certainly echo wider findings and wider accounts that people are telling us about it. We also, just addressing the question about definition of learning, we give people this definition and then ask them if they're learning. So it's very much depending upon whether someone recognises what they're doing as being learning. And of course, two people can be doing the same thing and one person very much see it as learning and another person not. But I think the survey captures people's perception of themselves as being learners. And then a third question about regional differences. We see regional and national differences across the UK every year, and some of those differences are very similar to previous years. What you will see is that in the southern part of England, in particular, there's much higher levels of participation, and that often reflects makeup of populations. But as we have devolved learning and skills policy, we might also see some of the reflections of that coming through as well. Now to our panel, some questions in the chat. One, thinking about how we can encourage employers to encourage more people to engage in adult learning. I'm particularly mindful of when we looked at those figures by furlough. If you had a full-time employment contract, you were more likely to be learning if you stayed at work. Maybe that's because you had to learn how to use Zoom. But how do we engage, and how can employers play a part in engaging people in learning? I think we'd called that when we had the job retention scheme, there should have been a focus on learning and training, and government really encouraging people to do that. There might be things we could build into the current furlough or current schemes, but I'd like to know the thoughts of our panel. If you'd like to kick off.
Yes.
Baroness Garden.
Yes, I think this is a difficult one. I remember years ago when I was working for City and Guilds on their Senior Awards programme, and we worked with Ford, and they had a programme, I think it was called EDAPT, yeah. Education and Development or something like that, where all their employers had to learn something which had to be completely irrelevant to their job. So, you know, ballroom dancing or fencing or something like that. And just so that they got in the way of learning. And they reckon they could easily justify this economically. I mean, obviously it cost the firm quite a lot to put on these very, very different programs, which were actually nothing to do with manufacturing motor cars. But they said the thing was that people got in the way of learning something new, and they got a confidence about what they could do because they were doing something they had chosen to do. So I think the employers who do encourage learning find very rapidly that this is a benefit to them and to the workforce. But it's making that initial step, isn't it? And particularly at the moment when they're so stretched with everything else, I should think the last thing on their mind is trying to encourage their employees, the ones they've got left, to do anything new.
Absolutely. Sue Pember, can I come to you? I'm conscious that the survey shows that when people get involved in learning, they're more likely to carry on. So a key role for employers, as Baroness Garden says, but also for wider charities, community groups, local organisations.
Yeah, I think there's two thoughts there now. I mean, we keep on saying things in the skills word needs to be employer-led. But when I talk to employers, what they'd like is it made easy for them. They don't particularly want to lead it. They particularly want it, expression of the day, have them ready. That if they join a training scheme, they lend their name to it. The administration's done for them. It's all the content is done for them. The assessment's done for them. And I think we need to think about, the role of employers these days now in a different way. That, how can we make it all easy for the employee to continue with their training or go on a new training course, and make it really easy for the employer. And I don't think, using the term employer-led is the right way. I think we should be seeing the employer as the customer and do everything for them to help them allow their individual to be trained. And then with the individual, I really think the onus has to be on the individual. It's only individuals who can actually learn. It doesn't matter what strategy the employer has round it. It's the individual who has to put, their head on the screen. They have to learn the text. They have to do the exams. It's only the individual. And what I found from COVID, especially looking at the apprenticeship world, how fragile our systems are. So if if an apprentice has been made unemployed, it was really difficult for them to pick it up with another employer if they could get another employer. So I think we need to rethink our concept, make it absolutely easy for the employer, but concentrate on giving the entitlement and the funding or support to the individual and making them own it. They own their own training. And then we need to think, there's 30% in the gig economy now, they don't have an employer. We need to talk about those, and we need to talk about those on zero contracts, because often they work for multiple employers and they don't have an employer. So my way of the future is, let's give the whole responsibility to the individual and make it easy for the employer.
Great, thank you. Patrick?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all the things that have been said there so far. I think I guess one of the observations I would make as well when we think about the employer's role in adult education, engagement in learning, is, for me, there's a bit of a distinction here between whether we're talking about employer engagement in a state-funded programme as opposed to employer engagement in actually just something that good employers should be doing anyway with their employees. And, I've got the value and the virtue of working for City and Guilds, and we've got a very strong staff development program in place, and we encourage a whole variety of learning, as you probably expect from an organisation like us, in terms of trying to instill that belief and the value in learning for our workforce. Through our Princess Royal Training Awards program, we see every year many good examples of where employers have recognised the value in engaging in training programs for their personnel, not all of which are supported through state funding. Some of them are just because the employer thinks it is the right thing to do through their personnel. So I think there's always worth just recognising those two dimensions to it. I agree absolutely with what Sue said. I think if we can reinstill some kind of mechanism that puts some of that power in the hands of the learner as well, through a mechanism that allows them to see how an investment in development and learning, albeit facilitated and supported by a good employer, could actually lead to a beneficial outcome for them. And whether that's through a maintenance system or a loan system, I don't know. But I think if there was a mechanism that takes a little bit of that support away where it is a financial barrier that exists for them, I think that would be useful. Equally, those things, as I said before, the more that you can link that engagement in learning into a high chance of a positive outcome or destination, I think you will reinvigorate a belief and a confidence in learning.
Can I just agree with Sue about the employers? Because I remember, because I was involved with the development of the first NVQs and then the first GMVQs. And in both cases, the government said employers will lead on this, employers will do everything. And of course, the employers were absolutely rubbish at assessment or teaching. And we kept badgering the government to say, for goodness sake, let the awarding bodies and let the colleges come in on this. And there was, I think it was retail or something, the employers decided that everything had to be in real time. So an angry customer or a fire in the warehouse, you know, you couldn't replicate this. It had to be, and we said, no, you know, you really cannot generate angry customers to make sure that all these people pass their retail. But it took an awful lot of battering. And one of the things that's made me angry about T-levels, which I'm prepared to be very angry about on all sorts of reasons, is that they kept saying for the first time, employers will be in the forefront of these qualifications. And I kept saying, for goodness sake, employers have always been in the, you know, there's no point in having a work-based qualification if you haven't got employers involved with it. And they go, oh, no, this will be the first time. No, it won't be the first. Anyway, but still, you know, I can get quite angry with the government sometimes when they are really boneheaded about things they really don't know about. End of rant. Sorry, I shall now revert to being a really nice person again.
I couldn't be expressed better.
Thank you, Sue. One of the questions on the chat is about progression. So we've seen, often because of circumstance during lockdown and what was available, a lot of adults engaged in learning that was online, learning that was independent, learning that was quite informal. And one of the challenges is to really build on that appetite to help people move, maybe offline or maybe onto other online provision, to make sure that they can then have the confidence and the opportunity to move on to other learning that will perhaps help them to pursue these interests further or to develop their skills further. What do we need within the adult education system or structures to capitalise on what we see here? Sue Pember.
Well, the first thing is that whether we had COVID or not, we do need to establish that real clear progression route. And something sort of strange is happening, I think is more by default or unintended consequences. But we haven't, over the last few years, we've lost our level 2 infrastructure. So what community learning providers are saying, you know, they work really hard, you know, they still get through their doors, over 500,000 learners a year. They still got, you know, 50,000 doing GCSEs in English. Their whole being is about progression. You get somebody through an entry level, a level 1, you might get them to level 2 in English and maths, but they need to go on to then something vocational. And normally that was the point that, you know, they would go to a college, you know, or they get themselves onto a level 2 apprenticeships. And there has been an erosion of the level 2 sort of bit on the ladder. And I think the biggest one was in apprenticeships, you know, this September, where we lost the level 2 in business admin, you know, where over 100 employers said that they wanted it and we still haven't got it. So, you know, you cannot be an apprentice at this moment, level 2 in business admin. Yes, there are customer service and yes, there are other things there. But actually, you know, if we are in an employer-led system and 100 employers want it, then they should have had it. And because of COVID, I think the nice thing would have been sensible to say the framework should have just been extended for another 12 months. But now not to have it, and now to have the public sector having to draw up their own level 2 standard just seems not right to me. And also you look at other level 2s, they're just not on offer. And that is a real fundamental platform in our learning, our progression route. And, you know, Baroness Garner's just talked about T-levels. You know, T-levels are level 3. And, you know, there was a statement last week that T-levels might be there for adults. Well, fine, but they haven't. You know, 17 million of them haven't got a level 2. So if they are going to do this jump onto level 3, they just need a level 2, and it needs to be a qualification and it needs to be confirmed in our system. And that's what I'm hoping from the FE white paper. I don't think it was a big conspiracy to get rid of level 2. I think it was just too many new initiatives at level 3 and we forgot about it.
Thanks, Sue. Patrick, can I ask you a question? We've got a question on the chat very much focused, I suppose, on the digital divide. It's great to see so many learners learning online, and again, it's somewhat to do with the circumstances of what's available. But how do we make sure that for those people who aren't online, who struggle with the tech or with the cost, or this is not for them, how do we make sure that they're getting opportunities to learn too?
I think it's a really valid point. I think one of the underlying challenges that we continue to have when we envisage a world which is so polarized. So, I think the difficulty can be that when we think about learning, the debate seems to be it's either online learning or it's classroom-based learning, and there's sort of nothing in between those two ends of the spectrum, and clearly there has to be. I think where you see challenges with digital divide, either because of access to devices, because of access to broadband, because of access to the kinds of data packages that people need to have. I think there are ways in which you could introduce programs that would give access to those range of things. I think one of the things that we call out in our push for community learning is that blend of saying where there isn't relevant home access are the ways that people can get into a location close to them, or you can take the learning out to them, which gives them access to some of those things as well. But it does need a variety of interventions in there to make sure that digital access becomes something for all. I think we can underestimate in this day and age and take for granted just what access we do have to digital devices and equipment when other people don't have access to those things. I was just going to pick up quickly on the previous point as well, if I can, just to about those sort of thinking about levels. I agree entirely that I think we need to think about the point at which people step into employment, and that isn't just through a traditional linear route through education. I think increasingly what we're going to find in the current period is as people maybe have to re-switch and repurpose their thoughts about occupation and careers, that will not be a straight linear journey. That will be in some cases a step backwards to step forwards, and we need to think about what that means for people in terms of access to learning and to engagement.
No, that's really helpful. I'd like to ask all the panel, there's some comments on the chat about how the event is called Learning After Lockdown, but of course with the announcements over the weekend that we're about to go into lockdown, I'm interested in what you think we can take away from these survey findings for this next period and however long we're kind of living with some sort of restrictions. About what this means for what we do as providers, as employers, as individuals to encourage more people into learning.
Well, obviously the issue of technology becomes ever more important, doesn't it? And we tend to make the assumption that young people are all technologically able, but of course there are quite a lot of them who don't have access to computers or laptops or whatever. And the government is supposed to be supplying, all the disadvantaged kids who don't with these. But they seem to be stopping and starting that program rather disconcertingly. And of course, many adults, of certain, well, of course, I'm very old now, but, my generation, but even people younger than me, grew up before the days of computers. And so we have to learn it as a new skill rather than the youngsters who just absorbed it because it's all part of their learning. And I think that will become increasingly important that we enable adults to make sure that they have access to the technology learning that they need for their jobs, because more and more jobs will depend on it.
Absolutely. Susan?
Yeah, I mean, until yesterday, adult education centres were being supported to be open. And, many of them never actually shut because they do have 16 to 19, they do have a vulnerable client group. So actually they worked all the way through the lockdown and, and also they, supported their communities in all sorts of ways. And I think, yesterday said that, adult university and adult education settings should consider putting more of their activity online. And I think the adult community would have been brilliant, moving all sorts of things online that I thought were just was impossible to do, but they've done it. However, they have felt that people wanted to return to the classroom, and therefore they've been doing this sort of double offer. You can do functional skills in a classroom, safely, or you can do it online. I think from yesterday now saying that, adult settings should move to doing more online means that we've, got to find a way to fund all those people who actually turned up at centres the last 2 months. They turned up because they probably didn't have a digital device. So we do need to find a fund. Government does need to establish a fund very quickly so that centres can do that. We also need to have flexibility over the way people are monitored, the way that students are counted. But what I take from your survey, Fiona, is that people want to do it. But they want to start it. There is a sort of a love of learning that we haven't seen for ages. And whether it's you don't want to do anything academic, but you want to learn to cook, or you want to benefit your life in another way, or you want to learn how to help your children more. Many of my extended family has said that they've learned more because the child is doing their learning in the kitchen than they did through their own school life. And one person has decided to do geography GCSE next year because she's loving her daughter's geography course. Now I think we need to really build on that enthusiasm, but we need to build on it with proper pedagogy, with proper curriculum support, and we need to find a way to get devices and connectivity that with those who just don't have a device at this moment.
Patrick.
Yeah, look, I mean, I would echo all of that. I think I think that the reality of the situation that we find ourselves in, I'm sure if you're like me, then, I naively assumed probably that come the autumn, we might be past the impact of March and onwards. And, and now we're in the autumn. It's feeling, very likely that we're looking into probably next spring before we properly understand what any sort of semblance of recovery and return to a degree of normal might look like, because we just don't know. One of the biggest problems with the pandemic is that there is no end date to it. There is no end date that allows people to plan systematically for what you do in the interim period and then how you plan for recovery. So we have to, I guess, look at a situation where the current situation is going to persist in terms of the engagement and the impacts on people. Now, whether or not that means that we can start to look at, because I think the other thing that's happened, Sue, is I think certainly in my mind, our view of frontline workers has extended well into education and community learning in the same way as we've got a newfound respect for the NHS and for care workers. So they're very much in that sort of vanguard of frontline workers that we need to keep in place and support. So whether or not there's ways in which we can think about any utilisation of kit and equipment in local businesses or larger national businesses that could be redeployed and supported in other ways. Now, clearly, I'm not abdicating the responsibility of government to centrally fund those things as well. That would be very helpful, but also in terms of just a bit of a reality check against the whole range of things that people are asking for from budget. Are there other ways that we could mobilise forces to support people? I was struck by the school dinners campaign and how quickly local communities and business mobilised to solve that problem when perhaps central government hadn't stepped up to help in the way that you might expect. So whether or not there's some creative thinking that could be done there as well in terms of providing access to kit for people who don't have it. But as Sue says, are there people who have been turning up and wanting to engage that we want to continue?
Absolutely, thank you. We have a question from the audience about how the survey will be used by policymakers in developing strategies across England, Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. And that's part of our collective job as a sector to put these findings in front of them. If you were what would you want an education secretary in any of those 4 devolved nations? What would be the one thing you would want them to take away from this and put into practice? Baroness Garden, can we come to you first?
Well, I suppose, I come back to my theme that I would want them to take away that practical and vocational education is vitally important and is every bit as important as academic. And that's what is missing, I think, in government to quite a degree. And we certainly, obviously these findings are going to apply to the 4 devolved nations, which, are not really working terribly well together at the moment. But yes, so pressing it. I mean, I hope this has gone to the glorious Gavin Williamson, has it perhaps, or any of the other government ministers who might show an interest in education and training in BIS and so on. But really, at the moment in the Lords, we don't have any debates. We're just so ground down with all this blasted legislation, mainly sort of Brexit orientated, but it's COVID orientated if it isn't Brexit. So we don't have any debates, because normally this would be something where we would generate a debate, and there's masses of people around the Lords who are passionately interested in lifelong learning. But I can't offer that at the moment, I'm afraid. I can try and table a question, but again, it's an absolute lottery whether we get questions down now. But certainly trying to draw it to the attention of government ministers is vitally important.
Absolutely, and thank you for your ongoing support for this. Patrick, what was the one thing you'd like the Secretary of State to take away from this when it's under his nose?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd build on that concept slightly with it, and for me, the clues in the title of your organisation, Fiona, learning and work, because I think if there was one thing I'd say that they need to take away, it's the role of education and training in leading people into sustained and meaningful employment. And, whether that's via a university route or whether it's via what used to be 16, but is now, post 18 and a step into and a link into apprenticeships and learning in work, etc. And whether that's an academic pathway in or a vocational pathway in, they all fundamentally should lead to meaningful and sustained employment for people. And I think that's the thing that would absolutely stress for every education and skills minister across the devolved nations. That's what you need to connect. You need to connect those two things, and then you will instill a real belief in learning.
Great. And Susan, one thing from you?
Yeah, one thing for me probably was the same thing before COVID, but it's even more important now. In Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, all of them have got a lifelong learning strategy. And I feel deprived because England hasn't got one. So what we need is a lifelong learning strategy, and we need the FE white paper to give us it. And what we've proved through COVID is that, skills development leads to personal well-being. If you feel happy and confident, you're more productive and the economy does better. And what I would absolutely love was the first sentence of the FE white paper to recognise that. They're not separate activities. Learning a new skill leads to improved well-being, leads to better integration in society, and in the end leads to improved productivity and a better economy. And that's one thing that I want.
Thank you, Susan. I'm sure that's something we can all agree with. That is fabulous. It's great to have this event as part of Lifelong Learning Week. We're celebrating adult learners, their stories, their achievements, and also hoping to encourage more adults to learn. I'd really like to encourage you to join our Festival of Learning Awards tomorrow evening. You can sign up online to see some of our fabulous winners, the learning that they've engaged in and the way that it's transformed their life. And for me, it's just really inspirational when you see not just these big figures of who's there and who's not, but those individual stories of people who perhaps you wouldn't have thought likely to learn, but they get involved in learning, not knowing where it will take them, and it absolutely transforms their lives. So I'd really like to encourage everybody to sign up to that.
Can you send us the link for that, Fiona?
We'll absolutely put the link in the chat and make sure that everybody has a copy of it. Just to leave, I wondered if I could ask the panel if they've done any learning during lockdown, and if they haven't, what do they plan to learn during the next lockdown? While you think, I'll just say I took my son to school on his skateboard today. He was on his skateboard and I had to carry it back. And it did occur to me that maybe learning to skate it back is something that I should do, although I'm not sure because I might break my arm. So, Patrick, did you do any learning, or what might you learn next?
Did I do any learning? I certainly didn't try and venture onto any skateboards or anything like that, Fiona, I can tell you that. I'll tell you what I did do over lockdown, particularly during the first few months. I was fascinated by the wealth of wildlife that suddenly appeared. in my back garden and around, and a whole variety of birds that I'd never seen before. Whether that's just because I don't spend time at home looking out into the garden, I don't know. But and so I spent a bit of time just trying to look up what all of these various things were, and try and work out what they were doing in the back garden. So yeah, that was an interesting little venture that I went down during the first stages of lockdown.
Great example of self-directed informal learning. So fabulous. Susan, did you do any learning, or do you have any plans?
Yeah, I wish you hadn't asked the question, or because I'm now going to embarrass myself because the honesty kicked in. Yeah, I've improved my technological skills, you know, the work type ones. But, you know, we got quite a lot of teenagers in the family. So I've become a bit of a gamer. And I've gone up my Fortnite levels quite good. So, but let's not tell anybody.
No one's listening, don't worry. Baroness Garden.
Well, I've been forced to learn Zoom and Teams and all these other things. I suppose the only other journey, I've joined a quiz team, and so I'm quite enjoying that with some old university friends, and we find obscure questions to ask. And, you know, you learn quite a bit on quizzes.
You do, absolutely.
But sadly, I haven't watched any birds, but I live in a flat, so really all I see are pigeons, and I know what they look like, Patrick, I'm afraid.
Can I say thank you to the panel? Can I thank you to everybody who signed up to the webinar for all your questions, for all your comments. We'll send you the report and the slides, and please do continue to engage and to encourage others to learn during Lifelong Learning Week. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye now.